everyone. Good early evening. So I'm keen to welcome you to the final session of today's proceedings, or at least the final session before some of us have the opportunity to mingle over drinks later on, but I'll come back to the details of that later. So my name's Steve Yilley. I run the ESRC Genomics Forum, which is the principal sponsor of today's meeting. And my job is to chair this final discussion. I want to just start by saying a couple of things, one of which is that early on we had the rather helpfully provocative remarks from Janet Lewis from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who was talking about the difference in the decisions that various funding bodies had made about the ways in which to publicise and communicate their results. And I just wanted to, in a rather sort of selfish way, praise the ESRC for having established the very idea of a genomics forum. So nobody before, I think, had put large amounts of money into funding a research centre like the forum, which really doesn't do research so much as act as ambassadors trying to insert a voice for social science research into other activities, so that our role is to take the social science that's produced elsewhere in the community and maybe do a little ourselves, but also to make sure that the social science is represented amongst medics and scientists and others who want to talk about genomics and contemporary life science. And of course this was an invention of the ESRC's, and we're very grateful both because it's a wonderful role and also because they've been very generous in their funding of us, which has allowed us to, in our turn, fund events like this. And I also want to take the opportunity of thanking various people from the forum who've done the vast lion's share of the work today. So many of you will already have been in touch with Christine Knight, our policy research fellow, who is largely behind today's event. So thank you very much, Christine. And you will also have encountered Tony and Claire and Matthias, also from the forum, who've made the day very successful on a practical basis. And it will in fact be Tony and Matthias who are coming around with mics to allow people to ask questions of the people on the panel. Now, I'm standing over here not because I'm too conceited to want to go near the speakers, but because we've only got 7 mics. So this is mine. They each have a mic, so that's 5. And then there are 2 that are going to rove when we get round to the questions. So I've kind of got to stay here, else I won't have a voice. So what we now have the opportunity to do is to take up to 5 minutes reflection, building first on the introductory remarks that were made this morning and then on what people have thought during the day from our 4 panellists, who are all helpfully displayed on the, what is it they say in, sorry, I haven't a clue, on the laser display board, I think. So on the laser display board, we have Fiona Armstrong, Dr. Jane Morgan, Jack Stilgo, and Professor Judy Seber. So we're going to take people in that order, and we've already know Fiona because she spoke a little this morning, but we'll start with Fiona. Please.
Thank you. I will try not to repeat the introduction to the ESRC that I gave this morning, but what I want to do is try and reflect on the day and what that perhaps means for the ESRC and how I will take that learning back to the organisation. And I guess it's been a day of enthusiasm, and there's been a lot of ideas, and I think there's this idea of actually, as a social science community, we're uniquely placed to shed a different view on the process of knowledge exchange. But I also have sympathy, I think, for some people who are saying, but we need to keep it simple. It's all about relationships. It mustn't be overcomplicated. And I think there is a balance between actually wanting to over-theorize and over-conceptualize these activities and then just getting on with it. And we spent a lot of time actually looking at the different attributes and skills and qualities. There's the JISC oral project, which is ongoing, which was remarkably quiet given the fact that it was meant to be dealing with the skills of lots of people in this room. So I think the consultation is open. Go and give us your views on that. I'm on the advisory committee. But I think the skills of relationship building, of kind of sustained contact with users, the kind of foundations of knowledge exchange, I think benefit from a degree of simplicity. I was also struck by this idea of ambiguity, and there was a presentation from Clark looking at the different roles of boundary spanners and how they felt and how they dealt with this ambiguity of being in an organisation which perhaps had one kind of set of expectations and kind of clear expectations of roles and very hierarchical, and then actually coming in new to these posts, as I think a lot of people are, and expected to kind of grow that role from the bottom up. You know, so how does that actually kind of stack up against all of our experiences? And I think what I will take back is this idea of using evidence from social science to inform what we do, but not perhaps being driven by it solely, that there is a kind of realistic and kind of practical aspect that we must keep and infuse. So I think it's been a fantastic day, and I think there's so many people here who I guess perhaps wouldn't have been interested in this topic, you know, even 3-4 years ago, that I think it has been enormously valuable just to see the different communities gathered together. Perhaps we are now all in the one tribe. Perhaps not, if that's useful.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Next I'll turn to Jane, who is the director of the Scottish University's Insight Institute, which she'll explain.
I will briefly. Perhaps, and just to say initially, I came into the Institute, which is housed in Strathclyde University, after 25 years in the civil service, very briefly preceded by a spell in academia. So that may explain some of my comments, and I hope not make them sound too silly, but that's my personal background. Just to say a little about the Institute, because I think it does gel with quite a few of the comments that have been made today. It is a knowledge exchange mechanism, to use that term to convey something quickly. We start from the perspective, if you like, that many issues and problems addressed by non-academic communities are multidimensional and complex, and that in that sense, knowledge exchange around one piece of research, it's not always meeting those communities' needs. Of course, there's much aggregation, as you know, academics and others have noted, that goes on in the interface outside universities by consultancies and think tanks and so on. And I guess in a way, although I'm not sure my university funders would thank us for saying it, but what we're trying to do is to bring some of that aggregation and synthesis back into the university world, but not just as a written exercise, but more as a series of conversations and workshops. So what we do is we fund workshops proposed to us by academics that involve discussions from multidisciplinary academic perspectives and involving policymakers and practitioners. So trying to get some added value, if you like, out of that research that has already been funded. So I think it is knowledge mobilization. So that's broadly what we do. I hope that makes some quick sense. I should say it is a collaborative venture too, because I think, again, in addressing some of those problems that face organizations, whether in the public, third, or private sector, one university, very rarely, if you like, has the breadth of expertise or depth of expertise to do that. So it is very consciously a collaboration between a number of Scottish universities. In terms of reflections on today, I mean, I found it very valuable, and first of all, I think starting with Fiona's diagram, which looked at different aspects or ways to achieve impact, and talking about some exchanges which, if you like, are quite instrumental, and some are which were more conceptual and about reframing issues. I think that gave me a lot of clarity about the different kinds of proposals that come to us and what we might rightfully expect from those discussions. And of course, there's a lot of pressure to do the more instrumental because one might see a quicker turnaround, but perhaps that it doesn't invalidate those discussions which are taking place in a slightly different way. One other reflection, I think, is that insofar as we use the term knowledge broker, it did strike me that the activity is very different. If somebody is attached to a team of researchers, whether it's in children and families or genomics, there's a very clear subject matter that's being addressed, and the person who's involved is probably quite well versed in that subject matter. My role in facilitating knowledge exchange is across a whole range of subjects where I couldn't hope to do that. So I think the expectations of that knowledge broking role have to vary quite considerably depending on the breadth of subject matter within which one is dealing. And I guess many of us here today are at one end of the spectrum, or indeed somewhere in the middle. I think that's enough for me for a minute.
Terrific. Okay, and I think next we'll go to Dr. Jack Stilgo, who is an escapee from Demos, and now, and from the Royal Society, I guess, and is now Senior Research Fellow at University of Exeter Business School.
Thank you. Right. So, as Steve described, I spent 4 years at a think tank, 3 at the Royal Society, the UK's National Academy for Sciences, working in the area of science policy. And if you work in the area of science policy, you are acutely aware of hierarchies of knowledge, and you feel your physics envy keenly. And as a social scientist, I would love to be able to point to a hard fact and say, that is my piece of knowledge. Here, policymaker, do something with it. As a policy person, I would like to be able to point to social scientists and say, you know this, now let me go and do something about that. But I think most of us social scientists know that that's not really the reality of the situation, and that, as we've heard today, it's messier than that in myriad ways. And we're all familiar with the tragedies either of good knowledge being ignored by policymakers or bad knowledge being held in too high regard for rather arbitrary reasons. And we know as social scientists that often it is ourselves as people and the movements that we make and the connections that we draw that make the difference, rather than the papers that we write and on whose desk they end up in government. So with that in mind, I'd just like to really make 2 points that I've got out of today. And the first is about diversity, and the second one is about an idea of experimentation. So on diversity, I think we've had a lot of discussion today about the various roles, some of them well established, some of them new and emerging, that we or others are expected to play, and the names that we might give to those roles. And much of the discussion has been about whether those are in some way homogenous, or if there is a huge amount of heterogeneity there. And I would say that the heterogeneity was inevitable and a good thing. So I think in terms of policy in this area, and this perhaps explains some of the reaction to the impact agenda, do we think that policy in this area is either enforcing a homogenous idea of what knowledge brokering, knowledge exchange, or whatever we might call it, is, or is it actively encouraging it? Do we, for example, have a broad sense of what think tanks do, of what the media do, what researchers do, and can we allow for a range of different approaches that people take? Because it strikes me that as soon as we get too strict about a division of labour between researchers and knowledge brokers and receivers of their wisdom, then we're in trouble. And there are already plenty of incentives within academia that force us into particular tram lines. And I would say this is one area that needs to try to escape from them. Now, with that in mind, I mean, part of the recognition of diversity is about recognising that policy processes themselves are hugely diverse, and that our modes of engagement with them will be so too. And I was particularly taken by John Young's talk this morning, when he was talking about quite how messy governance is, and the complex multifactorial non-linear system that he described, that to the rest of us who've moved in that world is just a plain old mess, with people muddling through just as they do in any other area. But it strikes me that part of his recommendation, which is about the idea of, well, actually a system of sort of social learning or experimentation to engage with that. And there's a danger in quite a lot of talk in this area that we assume that the policy world is neat and tidy, even while we recognise that the research world it is messy. And I think part of our task should be to get away from thinking that policy is a fait accompli, and instead recognise that it's part of an experiment that we should engage in as well. And it strikes me that questions of social scientists telling policymakers what to think in particular areas. We might also want to put on the agenda the question of how we can, as social scientists, find new ways to tell policymakers and politicians what to think about, because the much more important political question of priorities is something that I think quite often is left out of this. We sort of assume that all policy issues are equal. So my challenge, I guess, if we recognise that policy is more open-ended than its caricature, how can we also be part of that experiment?
Very nice, thank you. And fourthly, we have Professor Judy Sheber. So, please.
Thank you. Okay, I spent 6 years in government and 30 years in academia, and the 6 years in government felt more like 30 years. But the 30 years in academia, at times, I felt very frustrated that findings were not accessed by people who could use them. And so that's been an ongoing challenge. I noted that there are actually very few government people here today. The exception is the Department for International Development, well represented, and they are, as I think you mentioned, John, stars at the moment in terms of their research activity. I think you mentioned them in your presentation. The Scottish government rather better represented than the English government. And I think that's important in terms of the points I just want to make. I want to make 4 quick points. The first one is, I think we need more attention to political influence. I think this touches on what you just said, actually, Jack, in terms of research use. So as we've acknowledged today, intermediaries are, they vary hugely. Some of them excel in things like communication, their contacts, which ministers greatly appreciate, the speed with which they work, and their intellect, interestingly, which is sometimes challenging even to those of us in academia, I have to say. And I think that that's there's some of the reasons why they've been very successful in getting their research better used than some academics. But most of all, they understand the policy process, which is what you were just talking about. They understand the messiness of it. And research used by politicians is unlikely to be explicit, transparent, or visible, however much we want it to be, because if it was, they would lose their jobs. If you think about the kinds of research that some of us are producing, it wouldn't necessarily go down well with voters. So I think we have got a tension there. And many of the ministers I worked with at the time, in the 6 years, preferred common sense to research. And I can understand why that was appealing. Janet suggested the need to take a longer-term view. And in one of the other sessions, Lorna Meir described attribution of impact to research as a nightmare, which I think many of us are struggling with at the moment. But politicians will still be allocating millions every day and can't wait for us to sort out our long-term studies. So, 2 quick messages on that. One is, I think we've got to keep looking at this drip feeding of research findings and how we can balance the rigour and the research integrity with the need to produce stuff quickly. And secondly, we need to look at interim proxy indicators for some of the measures we're using, particularly on evaluations. Impact, secondly, not always positive. You touched on this as well just now, in passing. Ben Levin, who works with Amanda Cooper and some other people here, talks about underuse, overuse and abuse. We only have to look at the triple vaccine story to see an alarming story of media resulting in abuse. Thirdly, joint practice development, which is a term I'm engaged in at the moment with the National College, what used to be National College of School Leadership, partly addresses this problem of knowledge transfer being one way and knowledge transfer and knowledge exchange involving moving information about rather than interaction. And they call it joint practice development as something which is about reciprocity between schools in their case, but it could be between anyone, as a basis for developing research-informed practice. And I think the Canadians are a bit further ahead of us in this, and some of the work that David Phipps has been talking about today illustrates that. And finally, it seems to me that we've mentioned, many people have mentioned value for money, returns for investment, etc. There is still a lot of research out there, good research, that could be used and isn't. So the further development of systematic reviewing, I think, is essential. EPI has made a tremendous contribution to capacity building in this area, but we need better access, we need better summaries and so on. And John Young talked about the recipe and the cake this morning. If you get the recipe right, you get the cake at the end of it. But my favourite chef, Darina Allen in Ireland, claims it's not about the recipe, it's about the ingredients. So the quality of the ingredients is everything here. If we've got the quality of research to distill in the first place, that would be a help. So I would suggest, finally, that systematic reviewing needs to be much simpler, more accessible, and yet maintain the rigour if it's going to be embedded throughout the system, and that we will need the kinds of organisations we've got here today, intermediaries, but the kinds of model, Social Care Institute for Excellence, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, to actually help us to communicate those findings, hopefully without political interference. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now, I think there are a number of themes that are coming out of the discussions during the day and also out of the responses here. I mean, I think one thing that struck me very strongly is just the diversity of backgrounds of people here. I mean, setting this up from the Genomics Forum, we had a certain notion of who might be doing this kind of thing, but then we were surprised by the sheer number of people who wanted to participate in this, but also by the diversity of backgrounds that's come from. So that was a point that has been made, but I think there's something very interesting about how there are a lot of people coming from very different disciplinary and substantive backgrounds who are converging on this area. I think there's a question that comes out of what was just said about, well, is there anything distinctive about knowledge intermediaries, knowledge exchange, knowledge brokerage in the social sciences compared to elsewhere? So even Judy was using examples from MMR and so on, but is there something distinctive about the social sciences? And also, I think there's something also to be said about this question that was discussed earlier about what's in a name. Have we made any progress in thinking about, well, what is the name of this thing that we're all doing, particularly as we will have met many new practitioners during the day. So we've got two mics, one with Tony, one with Matthias, and if people would like to make a comment or observation, preferably not too long, they need to do it with the mic.